In this video, I'm going to go over a whole bunch of the different types of articulation that wind instruments can do. I was recently having a conversation with one of the lovely members of the QuickStart clarinet community by email about these different sort of articulations, and I realized that they're actually pretty complicated. I also have been doing some composing lately, and I also realized in my own compositions that it's not always crystal clear what each articulation means, and I think it varies from wind instruments to string instruments to like percussion instruments or piano or vocalists. All the markings are a little bit different. So I wanted to clarify what the different markings mean for wind instruments and how to do them on clarinet specifically. So to start off, we have this very common and actually somewhat confusing articulation of just nothing. When there isn't anything marked on the note, it definitely means that you're going to articulate it and tongue it, but it's not really clear about how long or how short the note should be, and usually that's going to be up to the style of the piece that you're playing. So if you're playing something like a march, then maybe it's a little bit more marcato and there's a little bit stronger front to the note and a little bit more separation. Or if it's just a generic piece or a slow, pretty piece, then maybe it is truly legato. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate. With nothing on there, I usually default to a nice, long, sustained note with just a little bit of separation with the tongue in between. So you can see with these two little blocks here, it's pretty much a sustained note, just a little separation of the tongue right into another sustained note. So let me go ahead and play that to demonstrate. And also I'm going to do like a little tongue hand puppet to show what my tongue's doing inside of my mouth so that you can sort of comprehend and work on that as a clarinetist. And remember that the air and embouchure are always 100% steady, just as if you're playing just one long note throughout the whole thing, and it's just the tongue that's touching the reed and coming off the reed to create the articulation. So here is sort of nothing, just your generic legato articulation. Next up, we have an equally confusing articulation with this tenuto or dash. Some people interpret this as legato, and some composers, when they write it, mean like very legato, so super duper long notes really connected. And some people mean a little bit weighted with some separation. I think the second option, the weighted with separation, is much more accurate, though I think the first interpretation is what many people do. So I'm going to demonstrate the second one, which is the tenuto and the weight. This is how string players do it when they see a tenuto, is there's weight on the notes and maybe just like the tiniest bit of separation. It's not staccato by any means, it's still very full value notes, but there's just enough space to get a really, really clear, firm, heavy beginning to the next note. This would sound something like this. You can hear it's very similar to the generic legato that I did. There's just a little bit more emphasis, a little bit more weight to each note. This articulation is staccato. This one is much less controversial than the other ones, although it still depends on the style of the music to get exactly the right note length for the staccato. It can vary a lot. But what staccato means literally is that the notes are separated. So you can see with our little visualization blocks of sound, we have quite a bit of separation in between them. The way we achieve this on the clarinet, of course, is by bringing our tongue back to the reed, leaving the tongue on the reed a little bit longer so there's more dead space without any sound before releasing our tongue again. In most tempos, you don't have to do anything to the air or embouchure, you just leave the tongue on a little bit longer, like this. So that's it that I want to go into for the actually articulated notes. I have a video on the sort of like note shaping or like 3 steps to a note shape. So I'll put that up in the little link here if you want more about note shapes for articulated notes. But now I want to get into some more interesting nuances that come up when there's slurs involved. So unlike a articulated note, a slurred note has the tongue not touching the reed at all. So the tongue releases to start the note at the beginning of a slur and then doesn't come back onto the reed at all in between any of the notes because they're super smooth, very connected. There's no articulation to the notes other than the fact that you're changing notes. Now, an interesting caveat to that in a slur is when you have a repeated note, like these repeated E's here. In that case, you do have to lightly tongue to show that it's a separate note because you can't hear that it's a separate note because the note's not changing. So if I play this without lightly tonguing here, then this would sound like a half note or maybe a tie, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I put sort of a dotted line here to show that you do tongue here, but it's not changing the phrase or interrupting it. It's just to show that there's another note there. And I think in this case, this is the lightest tongue. You almost want to sound like there's not any articulation because it's still a slur where there's no articulation. But we do touch our tongue to the reed so that you can hear that it's 2 quarter notes rather than a half note. And that sounds like this. And you could see that my tongue moves ultra fast on this tiny quasi-articulation so that there's not a big space between the notes and it's as little space as possible. You have to be really careful when you're moving your tongue really quickly like that you're not moving it too hard and accidentally accenting or slamming into the reed on that note to cause a bump in the line. This is a really tricky articulation, but it's really good to master it and be really good at that ultra light, ultra steady articulation to just cause the tiniest bit of separation between the repeated notes under a slur. Now, if we were to add a tie, you could tell it's a tie even though it looks exactly the same as a slur, but you can tell that it's a tie because it's going from one note to exactly the same note. A lot of times ties will also go over a bar line because you can't just put a half note here if there's a bar line separating those because you can't have a half note going from one measure to the next measure. And that's the main function of a tie, although they do come up in lots of other circumstances. But now that we have a tie here, we're actually going to get rid of this little pseudo articulation in the middle there because now it's just going to keep sustaining. And this will end up sounding like a half note because it's 2 quarter notes long with no articulation whatsoever on it. You could also combine a tie with articulation too. It doesn't always have to be under a slur like that. In this case, you would articulate each of these notes, articulate at the beginning of this note, then just sustain straight through it, and then articulate normally on the way down. So if we're using our visualization, I would use my generic legato since there's no other articulations written on the articulated notes. And I'd have a separation there, a separation there, no separation here, and then tongue there, and tongue there. Still very legato. And that would sound like this. And you can hear this ultra legato tongue almost doesn't sound different than the slur because even on the slur, we're still changing notes, so there's a little bit of a change there. And when we're doing a very legato articulation, we still tongue, so there's just the tiniest bit more clarity and separation, but it's still very connected with really continuous airflow. And finally, we have some of the most confusing articulation markings ever, which is when we combine slurs with other articulations. For example, staccatos or tenutos, or even accents or other kinds of articulations under a slur. These are really tricky because they are very dependent on the composer and the style of the music. Again, sometimes a staccato under a slur means that these notes are a group together and they sort of belong together, but you should still articulate them. I usually end up doing a roughly legato articulation when I have a staccato under a slur. A tenuto under a slur is even weirder if you're thinking of tenuto being long and legato plus a slur. What does that mean? I think of that as the slur again is sort of showing a phrase and then the tenuto is still weight on it. with an accent under a slur can be similar to a tenuto under a slur, where you can kind of do it with the air a little bit, but again, it depends so much on the composer. Here's one interpretation of how I might play this. So you could see that I didn't actually articulate these notes, but you could still hear there was a little bit of weight on each of them because I was doing a little bit of an air emphasis, almost an air accent, but then you have to be sure to differentiate a tenuto under a slur versus an accent under a slur by doing more air or less air, so it can get really complicated. I would say this kind of articulation belongs more in piano music, where on the piano you can hold down the sustain pedal to get the long slur, for example, but you can strike the keys differently to have a different kind of articulation under it. Because of course the piano can't really do a true slur because every single note is a hammer hitting a string and is an articulation. So I think that's a lot of where this kind of notation comes from, because it makes more sense in piano music than in clarinet music. It also, a lot of times in piano music, the slurs are intended to just show phrases. So it can show that these notes belong together, these notes are grouped together, but of course you're still going to be articulating because a piano articulates every note. Whereas wind players have the luxury of not articulating every note and being able to do true slurs. So I would try to avoid this in wind music if you're a composer. If you're a clarinetist, then you're kind of stuck having to figure out what the heck it means. And I actually want you to leave a comment with some of your favorite interpretations or examples of how articulations work under a slur. I would love if somebody can come up with a really convincing and logical explanation of that, because for me it just doesn't really make sense other than the ways that I've explained it so far, and I think that's about the best that we can do. But if you think you have a better explanation of how this goes, I would love to hear it. I would also love for you to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it. And if you think you know somebody, whether it's a clarinetist, another wind instrumentalist, or a composer even, who would benefit from a better understanding of how all of these articulations work, it would be super awesome if you could share it with them so that we can just get this information out to as many people as possible. It's been absolutely so motivational to see how many subscribers I've been gaining recently. It really inspires me and motivates me to continue making these videos and making them hopefully better and better for all of you so that you can keep learning how to play the clarinet right now. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for liking, subscribing, commenting. Seriously, I want some answers to how you think that this should go. And I look forward to seeing you in another video.